Hello everyone and welcome to the first episode of the Month Check. It's sort of a brand new thing that I was thinking of doing for a while. Because of how sort of watertight and intricate my analyses are, being really long and just extremely detailed, I thought I wanted to have a series where I just sort of chill out, relax, and have a bit of a discussion about a new album that's just come out. And that's basically the basis for this series. I just want to analyze, talk about my feelings about a new album in just a much more sort of chilled out and nonchalant way. Because I mean, fuck, it can be extremely tiring at points just to constantly have these really detailed deep dives into albums. So obviously, as you can see by the title, Donda has finally come out. I did a few reaction videos to the listening events thinking, oh, it's a listening event, this is probably going to be the album, and then everyone found out no, it's not the album. It wasn't even fucking finished on the first one. The first listening event, I listened back to that recording, was one of the most disastrous, unfinished pieces of shit I've ever listened to. And I can't believe I enjoyed any of it, to be fair. Even the good tracks on the album were fucking bad in that one. But yeah, now that we've got the full album, I've listened to it repeatedly and have finally decided that it's a mixed bag for sure, but I think I found myself enjoying it a whole lot more than I originally thought I would. So basically, I'm just going to run through all of the tracks and give my thoughts on each individual one. I've written notes to all of them, and I made the intention to be completely unbiased. That means both in the positive and negative sense, as in, I'm not going to buy into any sort of hype. The whole Return of the Throne thing with Jay-Z on the album, that doesn't affect anything for me, because I personally know how invested, like emotionally attached, some people are, and that might sway their opinion on the actual music. But also on the flip side of that, I'm not going to have any prejudgments like I might have done in the past to Kanye's previous music. So the album starts off with Donda Chant, which is an extremely boring track. I don't know if there's really anything else to say about it. It's just Donda, repeated over and over. The only time I'd ever really listen to this track is if I know I'm going to be listening to the entire album. Because as an intro, I guess it works. But, you know, intros to albums, you know, they should get you invested. They should get you hyped up. It sets the scene, but it is just fucking boring. It's not music. It's just someone saying Donda over and over again. I heard a theory about this song as well, that apparently the amount of times that Donda is said is apparently 58, signifying when Kanye's mother died. But it's not true. It's said 60 times. I counted. It's 60. The one thing I did take away from it is sort of primal elements of the track, which I kind of liked. And sort of, it does sort of represent a heartbeat to me. Sort of like you hear the peaks and troughs. But yeah, other than literally those couple things, it's nothing. It's a nothing track. You'd always skip it if you weren't listening to the entire album. We then get the track Jail, which is of course the infamous Jay-Z feature. Kanye's singing on this track is really good. I like the guitars on it. It keeps everything sort of engaging. Jay-Z's feature is obviously good. A slight problem I have with it, which is a problem that is shared throughout a lot of these tracks, is that despite being engaging and, you know, working as a track, having it as just the guitars, just repeating the same chords over and over again, it feels like it doesn't reach its maximum potential. It feels like there could have been such an expansive track here, but it just doesn't ever reach that. The first time I listened to it through, I was wondering what people outside of Kanye's fanbase would be thinking. Because, I mean, these first two tracks are, well, the first one's completely bizarre if you're listening to it, or boring, depending on who you are. And the second one is just sort of the same rhythms repeated over and over again, with little to no variation outside of the lyrics. As I said though, it does manage to stay engaging and keep your interest throughout. The string section that's introduced over Jay-Z's part is really fucking beautiful. And to be honest, I think it feels like the first real track of the album that's like sort of setting you up for what this album might entail, despite how mixed up and weird everything eventually gets. The final sort of drum beat part on the end of the track feels completely unnecessary. I mean, it sounds good, but it's just pretty unnecessary in general, especially because those drums could have done so much more work by being layered into the actual beat as opposed to just stuck on at the end. It just feels like a weird inclusion. Anyway, Jail is a good track, despite how repetitive it can sometimes feel. We then get God Breathed, which is another extremely repetitive track. There's something about the repetition of like the choruses on these tracks, which make them feel especially drawn out and long. And coming off Jail, I don't think it was a good decision to have another track which is very sort of hook intensive. I think the choir on this track sounds absolutely brilliant, and the distorted vocal sample that gets sort of thrown in and sort of panned across your ears is extremely cool and keeps my interest. I think it has to be said that Kanye's verse on this track is extremely Kanye. But it's extremely good as well. I don't think you can get any more Kanye than Dustin Hier Hoffman. Like, what the fuck does that even mean? The verse from Vori on this track I noted as being extremely pretty, but there's a pattern that's picked up on this track that lasts throughout the entire course of this album, where it just feels like it lingers for no apparent reason. Like a lot of these tracks on this album feel like there could be a whole lot more tight and concise, but Kanye just opts to sort of let them run their course in the most boring way imaginable. Like, if the track was shorter, the distorted vocal sample would be really impactful, but just for how long the track runs out, it ends up actually ruining that sample for me, just because of how many times it's repeated over and over again. In the last 2 minutes of this track, it just sort of, it goes nowhere. You hear the choir in the back, hear the sample come up, but like, I don't know why it had to last that long. Well, it didn't have to last that long. It just ends up being completely bare, and I just thought in my mind, like, this sounds like an outro. This already sounds like an outro to the album. This should be like the fade off at the end of the album, but we're the third track in. We then get taken to Off the Grid, which is a fucking incredible banger. It's engaging from start to finish. I'm not particularly a hook kind of man. I don't really like the repetitive nature of it, but it's undeniable that the chorus on this track is so fucking catchy. I think Kanye's verse on this track is particularly engaging and is executed extremely well. And I found myself surprised at the Playboi Carti feature, because I don't particularly like Carti all that much, which is a bit unfair, because I haven't really listened to a lot of his stuff. But the stuff I have listened to, I just felt like it was way too auto-tune centered. Which I know is his style, and if I don't like that, that's more based on personal opinion and not actually based on the quality of the track. But I actually found myself really enjoying his verse on this. It fits really well with the type of beat he was working on. The verse from Fivio or Fivio or Fivo, I'm not actually familiar with the artist, is absolutely incredible. I especially like the introduction of the bass which comes in on his verse, which plays into the sort of drill influence on this track and does it justice as well. It's not like a sort of knockoff version. It's done really well. Anyways, his verse is one of my favorites on the entire album. I really like how he sort of just goes on and on. If I looked at the length of that verse and saw it was a feature, I'd probably think, fuck me, this guy's just never gonna stop rapping. But he keeps you engaged throughout the entire thing. His delivery is hard and to the point. And yeah, I like how you sort of feel like this guy's unfiltered. Like he's been given the chance to do a verse on Kanye's album and he's not gonna waste that. So he's just bringing out all of his best material and saying everything he needs to say on the track. Kanye's verse on the back end of the track is good, but there's a slight little nitpick which I'm sure people will get annoyed at me for, but it's just a detail that I don't like. It's where you can hear the cuts between his different takes. If you listen to the track, it's very noticeable. Like in between a lot of the lines, you can hear the cut towards a different take. It's not a big deal, it's just something that I personally don't like. I definitely prefer when you can hear rappers like going all out. Eminem is one of those who just sort of goes off and you can tell all of it is genuine, but like no cuts. And one thing I've got to say about this track is that despite being lengthy, at no point did I become bored, disinterested, or feel like it was overstaying its welcome. Oh, and the bestie messy lines, are fucking terrible, but it's extremely Kanye, so you can't really argue with it. And the fucking drop after those lines is so sick, it's unreal. We then get taken to Hurricane, which upon first listening to it, I really didn't like, and I have no idea why, but I just didn't like the tone of the track. What I mean by that is, in the first listening events, I really didn't like the sound of the track. And maybe the inclusion of The Weeknd on this track completely saved it for me, I don't know, but it's definitely one of my favorites off the album now. The chilled out nature of the track is extremely sort of calm. I love the bright and uplifting feeling of the track, which is some weird complaint that I've seen a lot of Kanye fans have. Like, I don't actually get the argument. Like, I've seen in the comment section of, like, tons of videos where people somewhat give critiques and criticisms of Donda. That people say, oh, it's just because you don't like the bright and uplifting tone. You don't want to be uplifted. It's like, no. I'm pretty sure people actually want to hear that kind of stuff. It's just, you know, if the quality's not there, I'm not going to enjoy it. But on this track, the quality is definitely there. It's a nice change of pace from a lot of the previous tracks because they were slightly more intense. I mean, The Weeknd on this track sounds absolutely incredible, obviously. His singing is just absolutely on point with this one. And I'm not that familiar with Lil Baby's music, but if his feature is in any way representative of the kind of music he makes, I probably won't be a big fan of it, but I was surprised by how much I actually enjoyed his verse. I think purely just because how well it actually fits into the track. I remember the first time I heard this track, and the opening of Kanye's verse, the only way I could describe it is extremely iconic. It might sound weird to say, even at this point, just because how early we are into the life cycle of this album. I mean, I'm sure this album's gonna get a complete redux in a couple months. But yeah, it just seems like one of those things that's gonna be noted down in Kanye's career and, like, called out as, like, this is Kanye. This is who Kanye was. He keeps on with the same sort of stuttery delivery that was on Off the Grid, which works, but I mean, if he kept going on after that, I'd start to be getting pissed off. On the back end of his verse, you can especially hear how raw his vocals are. You can hear sort of like a white noise or distortion in the background. It's not distracting. It actually works in the context of this track. But it's those kind of elements where I think, is this intentional, or is the thing Kanye said about Universal releasing it without his permission sort of representative of how sort of raw this album is? I mean, we'll touch on that more later, but there's definitely elements of this album where I think this is fucking unfinished. There's no way this would have been released under normal circumstances, but we'll get onto that later. The outro of the track is like unbelievable. The way it picks up with the introduction of the drums and the choir at the end. It's definitely one of my favorite Kanye tracks in a very long time. We then get Praise God, which, you know, I noted it has something about it which feels like a Jesus is King leftover. My favorite album. I'm taking a piss. It's not my favorite album. Literally, it's nuts that. Like, let's just take a little diversion here. This is what the Month Check is for. Jesus is King. I feel like it was so overly hated. Like, I know how sort of raw that album was and sort of messy it was, but it sounded good. There were some interesting sounds on there. Tracks that I don't feel get talked about enough is songs like God Is, which has this weird 8-bit sort of beat to it. So that's like, we've never heard Kanye really rap over a fucking 8-bit beat. I guess it comes from the whole turbo graphics thing. I don't know, I feel very alone in that. I feel like pretty much everyone says that Jesus is King, it was just shit or nothingy. But the album at least was a lot more complete than Donda, at least I feel. Donda has definitely a lot more highlights and is a better album in general. But Jesus is King, overhated, I swear, man. Anyway, Praise God. It has a similar style to Jesus is King, and I really like the chord progressions on this track, and once again, the choir. Travis Scott obviously fits perfectly onto this track. It was at this point in the album, though, I started to become a bit worried about how varied the beats are on this album. Obviously, there's a tone to this album, and somewhat of a consistency that runs throughout all the tracks, which is fine, because there are definitely concepts within this album. I'd call it a concept album, but it's so all over the place, I can't really call it that. But yeah, there's obviously a heavy emphasis on like the drum and bass, on a lot of these tracks, with a much more trap-heavy influence to a lot of these tracks. As a long-time Kanye fan, I always find a bit saddening, just because how sort of expansive and rich all of his past work was. Like, go back and listen to Graduation and Late Registration. You hear these like beautiful string arrangements, and I guess in some ways it's admirable that Kanye is going away from that and deciding to go in a completely different direction. But just in my opinion, there was a lot more quality and variation in his past albums that I feel aren't being as represented in these recent albums. The track is pretty bare in general, with it just being passable because of the sheer quality of like the distant organs and the bass. Baby Keem's verse is overall bad, I've got to say. It takes way too long to get to the meat of the verse, where it actually starts to get engaging when Baby Keem gets into his like flows. I'm not that familiar with a lot of his music. I haven't been familiar with him for a long time. But obviously with the Kendrick feature on the latest track, I've been listening to his stuff, and I find Baby Keem to be the worst part of all of his tracks. Like the Family Ties song he released recently, I literally just skip to Kendrick's part every time because I really fucking like Kendrick's verse on that. I'm so excited to see where he goes in his next big project, because it sounds like he's evolved again. Anyway, off topic, that's Kendrick. But yeah, I just feel like it takes way too long to actually get into it. Like he's constantly hyping himself up, and just sort of when we actually get there, it's underwhelming. And I mean, the high-pitched, screechy stuff is, honest to God, some of the worst shit I've heard on anything. And I mean that. It's so fucking bad and stupid. It's, I don't know, it's unbelievable. Actually unbelievable. Overall, the track's just sort of alright. We then get the track Jonah, which I really enjoy the instrumental to. I love the sort of sweepy, wavy nature of the track. Apart from Off the Grid and Jail, the whole album has been fairly chilled out, which I really like actually. It's been a nice change of pace from a lot of the stuff I've personally been listening to, but also for Kanye. It's a different style. It was at this point where I realized it might have been entirely intentional that he did the listening events in a huge stadium, because a lot of these tracks have this heavy emphasis on hooks and like chantable lyrics, which is completely fine. Vori once again gives an excellent vocal performance. I especially like the chorus on this track. And around here, I think I started to understand sort of the overall tone of this album. And the predominant style that Kanye's going for. Just, you know, fairly laid back and chilled out. Despite that, I still don't think that's an excuse to how bare a lot of these tracks sound. You know, there's an obvious intentionality to the ambience and, you know, chilled out natures of the tracks. Not wanting them to be sort of packed and filled with a bunch of, you know, different chord progressions and expansive sounds. That's obviously intentional, but a lot of these tracks felt like, you know, they could have elevated themselves. Sort of like they've been taken out of the oven too quickly. Kanye hasn't had the time to think this over and think to the full potential of what these tracks could possibly be. Although taking it away from that and looking at them as they are in the album, it still works, so, you know, it's not a big complaint. Anyway, Jonah, overall a good track. We then get OK OK, which starts off extremely exciting. You feel like you're gonna get another type of off-the-grid song. Kanye's fast delivery at the start I especially enjoyed. It just sort of grabs your attention immediately. There's a feature from Lil Yachty in this song, who I'm not a big fan of at all. I've listened to a few of his songs and I've got to say I've never been impressed with anything he's really done. But I've got to say his feature does start off promising. I especially like how the instrumental starts to get more intense as he starts delivering bars. But there's a weird thing with his feature which I haven't really seen anyone mention. It might be because I'm unfamiliar with his work. It might be an intentional thing that I don't know about. But as his verse progresses, he starts to sound really out of time. And intentional or not, it just sounds shit. I've got to say as well, the censoring on this album did actually start to get on my nerves. I didn't think it would be. And typically, Kanye West was the only person I listened to heavily that I thought was way too explicit. I just thought it was completely unnecessary. I mean, I didn't really have a big problem with it. I just thought it was dumb how explicit he gets at some points. But the fact that he's actually allowed swearing on this album, but has just censored it after the fact, I just feel is dumb. Like, you either go in one direction or the other. You either have these tracks being explicit, or you don't let anyone swear at all. It just seems dumb and like radio friendly to let these people and yourself swear on these tracks, but censor them after the fact. I mean, at least it makes sense considering Kanye's attitudes within these past few years, and I'm actually glad that he's stuck with this as opposed to just going back to being extremely explicit. It shows he has some form of consistency, as opposed to just sort of having this era and then moving on. Anyway, okay is... Oh, cringe, man. It's okay. It's okay. We then get Junya, which is an extremely dull track. Kanye's vocals are good, despite being very repetitive. It's one of the main tracks I identify on this album when I need to describe the lingering nature of the album. It just goes on and on with these looped organs, which initially sound promising, but quickly lose steam as they get looped over and over again, being stretched out through the entire track with no variation at all. Playboi Carti's appearance is nowhere near as exciting as Off the Grid, and he feels more out of place on a track like this, to be honest. It was just one of the most underwhelming tracks on the album. But despite that, I actually wish the track was longer, simply from the perspective that it could explore more ideas, perhaps get more ambitious, and maybe have another feature on the track, maybe. But yeah, not a good track at all. Believe what I say, hands down, the best track on the entire album. I don't care. It is the best track. But at the same time feels the most out of place on this album. Whereas other songs on this album sound uplifting, this one sounds so uplifting to the point of being like a summer bop. Like, it's usually the lyricism and message which are uplifting. A lot of the instrumentals on this album are actually quite distorted and reverberated, quite haunting in a way, which is completely contrasted on this track, sounding really clean. The bass line is unbelievably catchy, with the singing vocal samples in the back being really pretty. I think it's a clear example of how I personally enjoy tracks which are a lot more reactive and actually go different places and switch things up, as opposed to sounding the exact same throughout the entire track with just new features thrown in. I also noted that I was glad that there's just a song with Kanye on, because with all of the other tracks having like a huge amount of features on, I started to feel kind of overwhelmed and feel like this project was more a collective thing, as opposed to a Kanye West project. And I think that's an aspect which is obviously intentional. He wanted it to be a community kind of project as opposed to just him. I just personally wish it was more Kanye focused. Not to mention having all of these different artists with all their unique styles, throwing them into the same sounding tracks, it just starts to become strange. It starts to become overwhelming and strange, having a mix of all these styles. Who knows? Perhaps in a few years' time, this will be seen as a genius landmark moment, combining all these styles. Who knows? I really wish there were more tracks like this on the album, because this just feels like a lone wolf, really. Both in terms of the sheer quality of the track, but also the tone of the overall album. However, just because of how out of place it is, doesn't change it at all from being hands down my favourite track on the album. And in fact, is one of my favourite Kanye songs, period. And I don't say that lightly, I'm very sort of old school, I love Kanye's older stuff, but something about this track just really connected with me. I fucking love this track. We then follow that track up with another one of my favourites on the album, 24. Kanye's vocal delivery is absolutely incredible. The organs sounded extremely beautiful. The choir that's brought in on this track elevates everything so immensely. And the breakdown bit where the piano is introduced just gives me chills every single fucking time. Not to mention, that then leads into my favourite Kanye delivery on the entire album, and there's actually one of the most iconic and recognizable deliveries from Kanye in a very long time for me. It's the entire Devil's a Lie section, where it's just so incredibly heartfelt, and I don't even care to say, it made me tear up the first time I heard it. Just with headphones on, it's just, you get so engaged into the track, and it's just so beautiful. I think it's also a prime example of how the rawness of this album can actually work to its advantage. It's just a shame that most of the time it doesn't, and it just feels unintentionally raw and sort of barren. I think it's especially engaging how it starts to get more intense towards the end of the track, and the "We Gonna Be Okay" chant is something we need to hear more of in a lot more music. Not literally "We Gonna Be Okay", just, you know, the message, the uplifting message is something we need to hear more of. And then the album takes a slight dip for me with Remote Control. It's not a terrible track, but seems bad in comparison to the quality of the last two tracks. The first time I heard it, I really didn't like it, but upon re-listening to the album a few times, I actually really enjoy the beat on this one. And once again, the sort of wavy, ethereal nature to it is an aspect of a lot of the beats on the album, which I really enjoy. I really don't enjoy the chorus on this one, especially with how Kanye draws out certain words. It's just a bit annoying for me. Once again, I don't know why, but the whistling part, despite me not really liking the track overall, just feels iconic already. I don't know why. I don't know why I have this mindset of iconic, but I just feel it. The Young Thug feature is nice and fits very well on the track. Young Thug is one of those artists which I've been recommended to touch on before. I listened to some of his stuff and it didn't really grab me. But I mean, I'm quite stubborn when it comes to music. I remember listening to like Kendrick Lamar and Tyler the Creator for the first time and being like, oh, what's this? And then they became my favorite artist. So I think I need to listen to more of Young Thug. And obviously, I think it's hilarious how Donkey is now part of Kanye West's career. We then get taken to Moon, which I know is sort of like a fan favorite of the album, and rightfully so. I think it's an extremely beautiful track. Don Toliver on the chorus is so good. Just extremely pretty vocal delivery. I mean, on a Kanye West track like this, if you didn't have Kid Cudi, like what are you doing? So obviously, Cudi's inclusion on this track is perfect and almost necessary for making the track as good as it is. He's just perfect on this. For some reason, I developed this mindset from how other people have perceived my like personal listening experiences, that I'm not just hungry for bangers on albums. Like, it's actually fucking weird how many people have told me like, oh, you don't like this just because it's not a fucking banger, or it's not fast, or it hasn't got loads of rapping in. Like, nah, tracks like Moon I can properly get down with because it's properly arranged, it's really fucking beautiful, and it doesn't just repeat the same thing over and over again. I think the track is a perfect length as well. It definitely doesn't overstay its welcome, and the fact that it's sort of a shorter track on the album just makes me want to replay it over and over again just to listen to how beautiful it actually is. I think it's such a shame that Kanye decided to draw these tracks out. It's almost like he's trying to squeeze every little bit out of these tracks, and it just doesn't work because at some point with these longer tracks, the quality always drops off. It never stays engaging. I just always find myself skipping some of these tracks because I feel like they've just run out of ideas and it's just repeating the same shit. So I'm like, I want something new. Let's move on to the next one. Despite not needing bangers on this album, we then get Heaven and Hell, which is one of my favorite Kanye bangers in a long time. It feels intense and keeps you on the edge of your seat from the start with this twisted, distorted vocal sample. The slow introduction of the bass is so exciting, and that synth sound that gets pitched up as Kanye delivers his verse sort of lets you know that you're in for something big. I think Kanye's delivery on this track is hard and to the point, with the synths coming in on his vocals once again for some reason sounding iconic to me. The chord progression is especially dark and sort of leaves you on the edge of your seat. As well as that, when the track finally explodes and expands, the sort of tribal vocal samples you can hear in the back take the track to a whole nother level. And I mean, I usually don't like it when Kanye like fucks around on one of his tracks with the whole blah blah on the back end of his verse. But I think it's okay on this track. I didn't have a problem with it. We then get the title track, Donda, which feels like a strange placement within the track list for me. I feel like it would have worked as a much better intro to the album than the Donda Chant, as there's actually a lot more to dig into in terms of Donda West's spoken word. The piano on this track is of course looped, but is kept engaging from certain vocals that are inserted throughout. The choir towards the back half of this track sounds extremely grand, and I really like the subtle key changes which you can hear mostly in Kanye's vocals, which are also very nice. It's a short track and is to the point, and I haven't really got a problem with it. It just feels like a strange placement within the entire track list. We then get Keep My Spirit Alive, which has a very good beat. I love the introduction of it alongside Westside Gunn's verse. Gunn fits perfectly on this track and is someone that I've only gotten into recently, and I really enjoy his unique style of delivery and a lot of the tracks he's had on his recent few albums. I especially like 327, which I initially listened of course because Tyler's on it. But yeah, I've got to look more into Westside Gunn, and if you haven't listened to his own stuff, make sure to go check him out. He's an extremely interesting artist. He's also prolific with his release rate. He releases so many projects in like quick succession. The chorus on this track from Casey is very pretty, and for some reason this track seemed to be like the revelations track for me personally. And what I mean by that is, for some reason with this track I started looking and piecing together how I felt about the overall album, and to start off, it's where I first noticed how long this album actually is, which was perhaps brought on by me feeling that the previous track felt like an intro to like the second half of this album. But also focusing on the lyrics of this track is where I started to realize how mixed up Kanye's messages are in this album. Like throughout this entire listen, I don't think I was clear on what the emphasis actually was. Sometimes he's telling people to be themselves and trying to lift people up from their like struggles. Then he's talking about divorce. Then he's talking about his mother. It was just confusing. Keep My Spirit Alive was a really good track though. Really chilled out. But for some reason, it was just a track where I started thinking about the overall product and how I feel like the album was starting to sort of wane on me. It wasn't grabbing my attention. It's so weird. Like, despite me enjoying a lot of these tracks, I wanted it to end, basically. I didn't want it to keep going just because of how long it is. I don't know, it's weird, and you can get annoyed at me for how confused I am, but I think this might be one of Kanye's most confusing albums anyway. We then get Jesus Lord, which has this bizarre, freaky intro to it, which doesn't fit with the actual tone of the track at all. When the actual beat comes in, it sounds very pretty. However, due to the sheer length of this track and the lack of variation, it does become incredibly repetitive. As I said before, it just feels like Kanye's trying to squeeze every little drop of quality from these tracks, and perhaps oversteps the mark in a lot of these. Like, you can see that just from the track lengths and the overall running length of the album, which I don't personally agree with. I think a tight, concise piece of work can be a whole lot more impactful than trying to elaborate and expand on tracks that should just end earlier. Kanye's first verse on this track is very long, but I think it actually deserves that running time. It's very heartfelt and almost childlike at points, which works because he's talking about his mother. The J Electronica verse I really enjoyed. It's tight and to the point. But the Jesus Lord vocal sample becomes unbelievably annoying after a while. I think it would have worked a whole lot better if it only came in for the chorus of the track. I think it's a chorus, where the tell me if you know someone who needs Jesus bit. It's overall a good track and really shows Kanye's lyrical prowess and storytelling abilities, even though I feel like the track could have just ended after his verse and been just as tight and to the point with the message. And of course, there's that Larry Hoover part at the end of the track, which I literally know nothing about, so I'm not even going to touch on that. But let's just say, in terms of the actual musicality, it does get boring. It just repeats the same beat over this spoken word outro, which I felt was the prime moment where the instrumental could start getting, you know, more elevated and sort of expansive. I mean, I always compare these spoken word sections to the ending of Mortal Man, where Kendrick and Tupac have the conversation. Like, literally, there's several different tracks in that outro which could work on their own. It's just So incredibly good, Mortal Man. I mean, the Mortal Man outro is spoken word done to perfection, though, to be fair. We then get New Again, which has this weird fade-in intro. However, the track is actually really good. Literally thinking about it, the intro of this track is so weird. It sounds like it's recorded off a phone or something. And, like, drastically picks up in quality once the actual beat is brought in. Kanye's delivery on this track, once again, is very Kanye. The chords on this track are extremely good, with the choice of electronic synth being very appropriate for this style of track, even despite being another one of those tracks which kind of stands apart from the overall tone of the album. I think it's obvious to see that this track has clear comparisons to Kanye's song Flashing Lights, which is one of, if not my favourite Kanye West track of all time. I mean, in comparison to Flashing Lights, this just feels like a watered down version to me, but that's a bit unfair. By itself, it works very well. I especially like the introduction of the choir towards the end of this track, and despite liking the track overall, I actually think it's one of the best on the entire album, I still feel like it was one of the tracks that had a lot more potential within it. It could have been the best off of the album if it wanted to be. I just really wanted to hear it go further with the ideas it already presented. We then get Tell the Vision, and do I even need to say, this is the worst track on the album, and one of the fucking worst Kanye songs I've heard in a very long time. I swear to God, man, when I did those first reactions to the listening events, I felt fucking delusional seeing people say like, oh yeah, Tell the Vision, sick bro, that track with the piano was sick. I just thought it was so shit from the start. I'm glad that people have actually realised this track is just fucking awful. It starts off promising, actually, I think, with the dark sounding piano, but obviously becomes quickly repetitive to the point of annoyance. I find it hilarious how out of place the Pop Smoke feature actually is on this track, where he just repeats the same things over and over again. Something I haven't heard a lot of people mention is how his vocals are clearly being isolated, with you actually being able to hear another instrumental underneath. It's so unfinished and is one of the clearest examples of the unnecessary filler and bulkiness of this album. This track didn't need to be here and never should have been here with the state it's in. However, we get taken from that incredibly bad track into Lord I Need You, which is an incredibly beautiful track, with Kanye singing being another standout feature, being on point once again. The background vocals are very grand and pretty. Kanye's verse is incredibly engaging, once again showing his lyrical prowess. I felt his verse was very heartfelt, and when the synths come in on the guard of safety line, I'm not ashamed to say it was another one of those teary-eyed moments for me. The feels on some of these tracks are mad. Despite me not thinking Donda is one of his best projects, I genuinely don't think any other Kanye West album has hit me in the feels as much as this. Maybe some parts of Yay did, but yeah, certain parts of this album are extremely fucking beautiful to me. However, I still think the KFC and Taco Bell line is dumb as fuck. Coming into the last few tracks of this album, we get Pure Souls, which starts off promising, but quickly became annoying for me, specifically with how the bass hits are mixed into this track. They are so loud and overpower pretty much everything on this track. I think the mix is a problem that I had continually throughout this entire project, to be fair, with it oftentimes just sounding unfinished and messy. I think the Roddy Ricch chorus is undeniably catchy though, and Kanye's verse goes extremely smooth. I really enjoy the flows and rhyme schemes he works with on this one. The organ is consistently good throughout this entire track, and I sort of just found myself bopping along to the track because of how smooth and free-flowing it feels. I also love the chord progressions of the organ in the outro, with Shensia's, I think that's her name, delivery being very pretty. However, in this final segment, despite the chord progressions being good, the audio starts peaking like fuck. It's literally insane. You can especially hear it when it starts hitting the higher notes, which, I mean, come on, is completely inexcusable for an artist of Kanye West's caliber. He's one of the most innovative artists of our generation with basically a limitless budget to work with. So it's fucking unbelievable that he has audio peaking. It gets so bad and so noticeable that it's obviously not intentional. I don't doubt this will eventually get fixed mixed in the Redux version of Donda, which is basically inevitable at this point. But I just think it's so fucking dumb, and I think it's actually really unfair on Shenseea, to be fair, as her entire vocal passage is really nice. However, unfortunately, all I can focus on is this horrible distortion that lasts throughout the entire outro. I think it's one of the only tracks that has this problem though, luckily, so despite the other tracks being messy, it never gets this bad. We then have the penultimate track, Come to Life, which once again is an extremely pretty track and hits you right in the feels if you can relate to what he's talking about. It's another example of an ambient and bare sounding track working effectively. It makes the ones that are unintentionally barren and underdeveloped stand out like a sore thumb even more than they already did. The way the track builds in the chorus is extremely smooth, and the introduction of the piano is unbelievably beautiful, with the distorted guitar sounds making us feel like we've sort of come full circle, reminding us of the guitar on Jail at the start. As the track progresses, the pianos just get even more layered and pretty. Kanye's vocals fit perfectly, being partially intense, but also airy and free-feeling. I think it's once again a perfect length, which actually is sort of a rare occurrence in this album, with most of the tracks feeling like they're running way too long. And I especially like how it lets you just sit with the pianos at the end, just sort of breathing it in. It reminds me of tracks like God Breathed, but just a way better version. Whereas on God Breathed, it sort of just lingers around and you're actually sat there thinking like, what the fuck is this? This feels completely intentional and works so effectively. And then finally, No Child Left Behind, which works effectively as an outro, sounding grand and ethereal. It's very simple in terms of the lyrics, but due to the sheer length of this album, I think everything Kanye had to say has already been said. The weirdest part of the track for me is how it ends. It just ends very abruptly. It's kind of weird. Anyway, that's my thoughts on Donda. There's obviously the part 2s, but they're not really part 2s. Everyone knows at this point they're just remixes. They're basically the same tracks with either new features or just replacing certain features. There's nothing really that stands out about these tracks, but I've got to say I did like DaBaby's verse on Jail Part 2, but I mean, Marilyn Manson on that track is... fuck, it almost beats Baby Keem for how fucking terrible it is. And that's Donda. My thoughts on it, I'm sure, will change when it gets the inevitable Redux, with Kanye already setting that up with the Universal released it without my permission kind of thing. Whether that's a publicity stunt or not, I'm pretty sure it is. I think everything surrounding Donda really took away from my listening experience. Like, despite me trying to listen to this album with no strings attached, no emotional connection, either that be a negative or a positive way, having to go through those listening events, just listening to the tracks at their worst possible version, and hearing that gradually and slowly improve over time, it just made me lose hope, I guess, in the album. And it definitely dampened my excitement and anticipation for the album. But overall, I've got to say, Donda works. The first time I listened to it, I fucking hated the album. I'm not even gonna lie to you. I really didn't like it. I thought there's tracks in here that are fucking terrible, go on too long. There's certain tracks actually that I really liked from the listening event, like the one about him and his family, talking about how he's losing his family. I thought that was extremely beautiful, that track. A bit dark and sad, but I thought that track was great, and I don't know why it's not included here. But overall, Donda, I've got to say, works. It's obviously not one of my favorite Kanye albums, but I've got to say I was surprised by how emotionally invested I got into it. I don't think any other Kanye West album has gotten me this emotional, really. It's very heartfelt, despite at points feeling unfinished. There's so many aspects here which are too good just to say this album's bad, because it's not. I think overall it does more good than bad. I think it's just the fact that a lot of these good tracks also have moments in them or things about them where you go, why did you do that? Like, too many of these tracks, as I said before, feel like they go on way too long for no reason. For no reason at all, literally. I think a lot of these tracks would have worked in the model of being shorter, just so you can replay these tracks and have these special moments that really stand out from one another, as opposed to just squeezing everything dry. But yeah, that was the Donda and the first episode of the Month Check. Let me know your thoughts on this series and the format of it. It's obviously much more of a podcasty format with me just talking about my thoughts on an album. But it was something I wanted to do for a while. And I do watch channels like The Needle Drop, and I think his analyses on the album and his overall review are fairly considered. But even he himself says he's coming at it from a personal perspective. And of course I am too, but I'm trying to remove that from when I talk about albums, really. I don't want my opinion to be any factor at all. But yeah, as I said, let me know what you think of this format. Partly the reason I did it was because I got this fun cool light kind of thing. But yeah, if you guys enjoyed, make sure to like, subscribe, comment on what you thought, and I want to know your thoughts on Donda as well. But anyways, hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.